Hi, it's Bob from INSYDIUM here, and we have got part 2 of our strange cloth simulation. This is how the original scene looked in the xParticles reel. So we'll open the scene we built in part 1 in Cycles 4D, and we'll create a custom material. We'll set up the camera with some depth of field, and we'll have a look at some optimum render settings so it'll render quickly with no noise. So there's a lot to get on with. Let's get started. So here's how we left our scene from part 1 of this tutorial, and let's just break down what we've got. So we can see these cloth objects floating around the place. They are underneath this subdivision surface, which I've just got switched off at the moment. In fact, let's do some housekeeping to make this make more sense. So we'll rename this subdivision surface cloth elements. All right, that's better. So underneath here, we have a couple of things going on. We have all of our individual planes, and they are sitting within a connect object. Now, the connect object is what the cloth emitter is referencing to make all of the particles which are driven by the cloth. So that's this emitter here. And if I go to the object tab, we can see that the object it's referencing is the connect. And what that means is that this emitter is spawning particles onto every vertex of these pieces of cloth. So let's just visualize that, and now we can see it. So there are all of the particles, and these particles are being manipulated by this cloth modifier, and the cloth deformer is what's deforming them and giving them all these nice wrinkles. So at this stage, we can forget about all of that, but I just wanted to describe what our scene is doing here. So I've got constraints are switched off at the moment, and that's just so we get a bit faster feedback. Now, the constraints are what stops our cloth from intersecting itself. It enables kind of particle-to-particle collisions. So it's really good, and we'll be using this in the final renders, but just whilst we're setting scenes up, we'll switch it off, and that means it'll play much more quickly in the viewport. So as you can see, we've got our cloth floating around, and then at a certain point, we've got our strange attractors modifier turns on here, at about frame 50, and suddenly they get whooshed away into the direction of that strange attractor. Very good. And then just finally, I've got one more emitter in my scene here. Let's do a bit more housekeeping. These are the dust particles. So let's just rename that as, we'll call it emitter dust. Now these are spawning out these particles which are being moved by some initial turbulence, the same one that's doing the cloth, and then they're getting dragged around by the strange attractors as well, which is really nice because that means that when we get this shot, when the cloth starts to move, those dust particles are going to look like they're being sucked along with it because of the difference in air pressure that they're causing. So that's going to look really nice. Right, so what do we need to do to get this set up to render? Well, first of all, we need to make a decision from what angle are we going to render this. Now, if you remember from the xParticles reel, what Mario did was he shot this from various different directions and cut those different camera angles together after rendering to put the sequence together, and it was to great effect. So what we're going to need is this. So we'll probably need 3 camera angles for this. The first camera angle just wants to be of the pieces of cloth floating before the strange attractors is switched on. So we can probably worry about that one after we've done the other 2. So the other 2 camera angles we want is this. We want one camera angle where the pieces of cloth are suddenly being jerked away from the camera. So let's have a look. As the strange attractors is activated, we want to see it jerking away. Okay, so there's it jerking. So I think these ones are going down in this direction, kind of away from the camera. So something like that. Let's just come in, and we want to be quite tight and quite close up initially, which will really give us a sense of movement as it's pulled away from the camera. So and then pulled away. So this is the sheet that I'm looking at specifically, and this one's looking quite nice, and we're getting some decent movement. So we're just going to keep coming in close to this one and seeing where we get until we get an angle that's kind of looking as we want it to. So let's just move back a bit. So I think this is the one I like here, but it's been obscured somewhat by this plane here. I think we can just get rid of this one for now, because we're getting really tight into the shot. So it doesn't matter if we lose one of the pieces of cloth for this render. So let's just find out which one this is. It's this one within our connect object. Now, here's something. I can't just disable this from the view, because it's the connect object that we're actually looking at, not these individual planes. So what I need to do to get this out of our simulation is to drag it out of the connect object, and then it should disappear. Okay, good. So now I can get in tight into this plane. This is the one I'm interested in. I want to get a decent angle of this. Let's just have a look. Something like that, maybe. Okay. So we have the initial development, and then we want it whooshing away from the camera, and then poof. Good. I think that's fine. I'm not going to do anything. So let's save that camera position for our first angle. So the way we'll do that is let's create a cycles camera, which automatically does it from this angle, and I'm going to go to tags, Cinema 4D tags, and get a protection tag on it so I can't accidentally move it. So my first camera angle is fine. So this is going to develop, and then it's going to be dragged away from the camera into the distance. Excellent. So then at this point, we're going to cut away from this camera angle. And we're going to almost go from the reverse, I think. So at this point, when we cut away, it moves away, stop about there. And then when we cut away, we want it to then be coming towards the camera. And it doesn't have to be the same part of cloth. It could be any part of cloth here, just the bit that looks the nicest going towards the camera. And a nice kind of circular motion would be good, coming towards the camera and then coming past it. So maybe these bits here, coming past like this. So when we're picking these, obviously we're not being particularly scientific. We're just looking for a bit that looks nice. So these ones are looking good. And then they come past. All right, so we're getting there. Not quite right yet, but somewhere around here is going to be looking okay, I think. So we wouldn't even be looking at this camera at this point. And now we'll cut to it possibly here. So let's... And then we want them whooshing past the camera. Okay, let's try that again. So the first part, they're coming away from the camera, and then we'll cut to this, and they'll be here. And then go past. All right. So that'll probably do for our second. So let's go to Cycles 4D, camera, create another one, and I'll just control drag that protection tag, and now they are both locked off. Excellent. So our kind of two camera angles are kind of there. Okay, good. So we can forget about cameras for now. So let's talk about rendering this with Cycles 4D. So what I'm going to do is let's go into my Cycles 4D layout. So here we go. So this looks slightly different. I'll just walk you through it very quickly. What I've got is my viewport here, tiny little viewport, but I don't need to worry about that specifically because we've locked our cameras down. I have my material node editor here where we'll build our cycles textures. I've got the real-time preview here where we'll see the render. And then here's my object list on the right-hand, bottom right of our screen. And the attributes manager here where we can make adjustments to the nodes and alter the elements within our scene. Very nice. So at the moment we can't see anything. If I hit render, we've got a blank real-time preview, and that's because there are no lights in the scene. So let's start by bringing in a Cycles 4D environment, which is like a physical sky. I'm just going to zoom in a bit. All right, and by default, as we know by now, we get a background texture applied to the environment. Here's the background texture, and it's just two nodes, an output node, which all of these materials have, and this background texture here. And all it is a color and a strength. But what we're going to do is we want to light this with kind of like a sky object. So it's almost like a physical sky in Cinema 4D. So if we right click and go to texture, we can go to sky texture, and I can feed this into my background. And now we have got these bits of cloth being lit by the sky. So let's just get some wrinkles in. So we'll run it through. Okay, so we're getting a little bit of colorization from this sky, which is great. What we don't want is we don't want to actually see the sky in the background. This is going to be on a very dark to black background. So to do that, we go to the environment object, and in the attributes, all we need to do is go to the ray visibility section. And this is like a compositing tag. And we can just say, we want the sky to affect all of these different channels, but we just don't want the camera to see it. All right. So there we go. So this is looking very flat and very bland at the moment, but we need this sky because we want some contrast in our pieces of cloth with nice wrinkles, but we also want them to look fairly well illuminated. So that's what this sky object is going to give us. Now, you can also see at this stage that now we've put some lights in the scene. Our cloth, you can't really see that many wrinkles in them. We haven't really got enough wrinkles for the detail. Now, if I switch on, you see we've got this stepping here because we've not got enough geometry for this deformation. So let's just go to the cloth elements, switch it on. This is the subdivision surface, and give it some subdivisions and it'll smooth out those. Okay, so that's better, but we still haven't really got enough wrinkles. So what we're going to have to do eventually is create more subdivisions in our planes. That's the only way we can get more detail and more wrinkles. We'll do that in a bit because at the moment they're not that heavily subdivided, and that means that we get really quick playback, but as a result we haven't really got the resolution to get the nice wrinkles. So we are at one point going to fix that, and we're going to subdivide all of these planes. But at the moment, as we're setting up lights and we want scenes to run nice and quickly, we won't bother with that. Right. So what do we need to do? We have got our basic sky set up. So let's set up some more lights. So what I'll do, so we can view these lights going in a little bit more easily, I'll go back to my standard layout, and we're going to put some lights in the scene. So our cameras are pointing this direction. So what we're going to do is just use a couple of plane objects to become scene lights. So the way in which we're going to do that is, let's go to the object list here and bring in a plane. And I'll just move this to the side. So there's our plane. And I'm going to slightly increase that. Let's rotate it round and move it. We'll move it up to illuminate slightly from above. Okay? So this is going to be a light. So to create a light, all we need to do is give it a Cycles emission material. So we'll go to create, and Cycles 4D, surface emission. Here it is. And we'll pop it on the plane. So I'm going to hold Control. So when we do that and we drag on one of these axis arms, it makes a duplicate. Great. I'm just going to let's drag that down. Okay. And I'm going to Control to copy this emission material. and stick it on, replace that on there. Hang on. Let's just deselect that. So the new one of them is going to go there. So now we have a different material on each. So now we have our two light objects. Let's go back to our cycles layout. And now you can see in the real-time preview that these are illuminated, and these are actually having an effect. They are lighting, they're adding to the lighting of the scene. It's not very noticeable just yet because they're not bright enough. So let's make some adjustments. So in one of them, I'm just going to give it a warmer color. So this one's become warmer. Actually, let's reverse that because this one's lower down. So you would naturally make the warmer, more sun-coloured one, the one that was higher up in the scene. So this one, we're going to make it a cooler colour. We're going to give it a subtle blue. Give it full brightness. And I'm just going to increase the strength slightly. So you can now start, if I just dolly in, let's dolly in. If I increase the strength slider, you can see that it's starting to have an effect on these planes. Okay, so let's just leave it there for now. And then on the other one, I'm going to give this one a warmer colour. And again, so I put the strength up, you'll see this warmer colour coming here. So let's just... All right, so we have a blue and a warmer, more sun-coloured light. Okay, so that's that. Now, another thing which works very well for this, and you'll notice in Mario's scene, this is what he has done. If you're, let's just go back to my standard layout. If you're rendering elements onto a very dark or black background, there is a trick that you can employ which gives you a nicer light fall off. And what it means is you're going to get slightly more nice contrasted areas in the dark parts of your object and a more realistic looking light fall off, kind of going off into infinity. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to put in a huge plane object, which is going to be black, which is going to kind of suck in the light and not reflect it backwards. So the way we'll do that is let's bring in a big plane. I'm going to bring it down to the bottom of our scene, hit T for scale, and scale this way up. So it's going to be huge. We're not going to see this, but it's just going to be there. Okay. There we go. So then let's go to Create, Cycles 4D, Surface, and we're just going to make a diffuse and put this on the plane. Okay. So then let's go back into my Cycles 4D layout. And in the diffuse, I'm going to set it to black. Okay. So if I dolly in now, there we go. If I switch off that plane, you can see we've got much more light reflecting here. And that's because the light from the sky object is going off into infinity, creating a very, very gradual fall off. Whereas with this huge plane reacted, when it gets to the plane, the light is being sucked in and it's not bouncing back. And so we're getting this slightly nicer shadowed effect, and that's because we've got a better light fall off. So this is a good technique if you're rendering on a black background. This works very well. So let's have a look at this. What can we do now? Let's go to our blue object and increase the strength a bit. All right. And I think for now that will probably do us for our lighting. Okay. So now what do we need to do? Well, we need to make a cloth texture actually, don't we? So let's switch our subdivision surface on and let's make the material that's going to be our cloth. So let's pull this down so we've got a bit more room. So let's go to Create, and there's a fantastic default shader in the surface shaders called Velvet. It's just off your screen here, actually, but that's Velvet right at the bottom. and it brings in this velvet node. So if I put that velvet onto our cloth elements, we get this nice satin looking material, which looks very nice. But what we would like to do is manipulate this a little bit more, because what this nice satin material doesn't have, it doesn't have any texture, so you don't see any kind of weave whatsoever. No matter how close in you get, you don't. It's just shiny. It almost becomes like a smooth metallic. So we don't have that, and we also don't have any transparency, so we can't actually see through any of these cloths. So what would be nice would be if these were slightly transparent, so we could see behind some of those. So let's have a look at how we might achieve that view, that look. So in our velvet texture, let's bring in a mix shader, and we're going to mix together some of these materials. So we'll put the velvet in the top, and we'll put the output from the mix shader into the surface. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put a transparency into the other input of the mix shader. So let's right click and we'll go to texture. I'll just move that up a bit, sorry. Texture, and we will, sorry, it's a shader and it is transparent. So we'll take this transparency and we'll put this into the other input. And now you can see all of a sudden we have transparency, which is interesting. And what the mix shader is doing is, at the moment, if the factor is on 0.5, it is equally mixing the velvet and the transparency node together in equal quantities. If I slide this to the left, it's taken more from the velvet, so the transparency is reduced. And if we drag it more to the right, it's taking more transparency and the velvet is reduced. So that is one way of sorting out the transparency. And that's starting to look better. Another thing that we can do is we can change this color. And the color basically goes from white to being fully transparent, or black to have no transparency. So we can make adjustments to the transparency amount by changing that color value. You see, if we drag it this way, it's going to gradually get more and more opaque, and that transparency is going to disappear. All right, so just leave it on white for now so we can see what's happening. So that's all very well and good, but we can do something much better and give a much more realistic looking cloth by using this factor input. So what we're going to do is get a black and white cloth looking weave pattern and feed it into this factor. And that's going to give us a kind of a weave holy looking cloth surface. So let's get that set up. What we're going to do, we're going to actually use one of the Cinema 4D tile surfaces for this. So how do we access those? Normally you could access it from a Cinema 4D material, but we can access it right in Cycles as well. So what we're going to do is right click and we're going to go to texture, image texture. So what the image texture node allows us to do is bring in a photograph, an image, whatever you want. But this is the beauty of the image texture node. If I just highlight it, here are its attributes. Just bring this up so you can see. We can, as an image texture, use any of the Cinema 4D inbuilt noises, gradients, colorizers, effects, all of these shaders that we have access to as an image, which is fantastic. So what we're going to do is go to Surface, and just off your screen is, I'll just lift that up so you can see that menu. If I go to Surface, and it's just off there, it's below Sunburst, it's called Tiles. And we get this Tiles shader. All right. And this obviously doesn't look like cloth, but if we click into the tile settings, we're able to adjust the pattern. So first of all, let's just change these colours. We want these 3 to be white. White. Good. We want... I don't think we really want bevel. Well, we might have maybe a tiny bit of bevel and a tiny bit of grout width. All right, so there's the squares. We don't want squares because that's not going to look like cloth. Let's just see what happens if we put the colour from this into the factor. Now that's interesting. So wherever it is black, we have no transparency. And wherever it is white, we have full transparency. And what has been created from that are these interesting, like, nets, which isn't quite what we want. But it's an interesting look, and so obviously this will animate through, and that's looking pretty cool. That's not what we want. So we need to reverse these colours. So what I could do is go into my tile settings and change all of these and change this one to white and this one to black. But actually there's probably an easier, quicker way if I just invert this output. So if I go to colour node, invert, stick it in there, and it's just going to switch it around. So now this is looking interesting. What have we got here? We have got our pieces of cloth with transparent bits here. Again, not what we want, but this is an interesting effect. So let's make some changes to this tile pattern. So let's click back into it. And I'm going to change it. So if we go to the pattern, we can change it from squares. And fantastically, there are 3 weaves that we have access to. So let's have a look at this one. So that's one of the weaves, which is this look, which is starting to get a little bit more cloth-like. So that's one. That's not right for us yet, though, still, I don't think. Although it's pretty nice. Let's have a look at the other weaves. Weave 1. There's a wavy pattern. That wavy is actually a wave. I misread it. There is only one weave. These 2 are waves. So ignore those completely because we're not making C. Let's go back to our weave pattern. Right. So all we need to do now, obviously, the weave is far too big. So let's just bring down this global scale to, I don't know, let's say 10. All right, so now we're starting to get something that's looking quite interesting. Let's bring that down even further to 2. That's perhaps fractionally too much, 5. Okay, so we're getting there. This is starting to look quite interesting. So what else could we do to make this look slightly better? Well, we could perhaps use this same image texture and we could put a bit of bump into our mixture. So let's take the output of the invert node and put it into our displacement. So now we've been given some bump, and it's way too much, but you can see that that bump is really making this look like a much kind of rougher textile material, which I really like. So all we need to do is just turn down the power of that bump. And the way we'll do that, we need to basically create a power slider. And we could do that just by bringing in a multiply node. So let's go to converter and math. Let's change this to multiply. We'll put the color from the invert into the value and the value into the displacement, which is just bump. And now we can lower this effect by bringing down this number to a smaller decimal. So let's just say, I don't know, 0.2. Okay. So this is looking pretty interesting now. I think, arguably, we have a little bit too much transparency. So let's change this colour to a darker colour in the transparency node to give us less transparency. All right. So at this point, we've basically put this material on. One thing that we haven't done is that we haven't provided it with any mapping information. We haven't told this texture how to be applied to all of our different planes. And what we could do, because if I just go to my object list here, because all of our planes have UV coordinates, this is the UV tags here, we can make sure that this material is mapped perfectly to these planes by using these UV coordinates. But how do we do that? Because our material is on the subdivision surface. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to drag this onto my connect object instead. And then I'm going to right click on the tag. And what we need to do is put copy tag to children. So now they all have a tag. And I'm going to remove the tag from the connect object. Okay. And if we look in the connect object settings, we have got textures ticked, which means it's going to use all of these textures. Great. So now that we've put the texture on all of these planes, we can now tell cycles to use the UV coordinates. And that's dead easy. All we do is in our material editor, we'll right click and we go to input texture coordinate, which brings in this node here. And we've got all these different texture coordinates and we have UV. And because all of these objects have UV coordinates, it'll be able to read those UVs. So what we do is we pipe the UV into the vector of that image texture, which means this is going to be mapped perfectly to our planes. All right. Good. So let's just have a look at these light settings. I think arguably, now that we've got that kind of bump in the scene and we've got this image applied, it's arguably a little too dark now. We're not really getting quite enough light. Let's go to one of our camera views. This one. So what we can do, let's make some adjustments to our scene lighting now. So I'm going to get my background object. Let's just try up in the strength of that sky. Okay. And I'm thinking this texture is a little bit too dark here, really, and maybe not zoomed out enough. So let's go back to my velvet. We'll reduce that bump by even more. Let's just put... Oh, it's on value 2. That's why I've got way too much bump. It should be a decimal. This one should be 0.2. There we go. All right, that's way better. Okay. All right, and I think we could perhaps go a bit smaller on that image texture. Let's give it more resolution as well. Ah, that's better. Okay, so we'll go back into the tiles. Let's move this space up a bit. We'll just make some adjustments here. And let's go down to, say, 2, 3. Okay. Good. So, I think we could perhaps benefit from... Let's just play this through and see how we're looking. All right, and our last adjustment, I just think this grout width is way too thick, so maybe this needs to go way down to, let's just try a decimal. Ah, that's looking better. Let's go lower. Yeah, this is what I'm wanting. Okay, good. So it's the grout width is hugely important. That for me now is looking like a nice textured material. That is looking pretty decent. Excellent. Right, I'm going to call that material kind of done. We can tweak it should we need to, but this is looking really nice now. We're getting a little bit of transparency so we can see other parts of it just poking through, but that's looking pretty nice. We're getting these weird stepping shading errors, but that's because we're working on low resolution planes, but that's looking nice. Right, good. So that's that. So let's just recap actually what's in this material. So what we have done, we have taken the UV texture coordinates from our objects and placed it into the vector of our image texture. We have then, in the image texture, we have used the Cinema 4D tiles shader, and we've done that in the weave mode to get this really nice looking weave pattern. We've taken the color of that and we've inverted it, and then that is dictating how this mix shader is shading together the velvet material and the transparent material, which is giving the illusion here that this is actually a weaved bit of cloth, which if you dolly right in has got these nice holes in it and really nice bits of texture. And then we're using the same inverted output of our image texture to give us a bit of a bump as well, which is just giving this kind of more shadowed area and a little bit more detail to these bits of weave. And we've just put that through a multiply node because we wanted to reduce the effect of that. So if we put it in a multiply node and multiply it by a decimal value, then it's going to reduce the impact of that bump. So that's looking really nice. Right, let's just go back to my regular layout, because what we need to do now is start thinking about getting more resolution in these planes, because at the moment we just don't have enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to frame 0, and then I'm going to select, what we need to do is let's select all of our planes which we want to adjust, and now we want to subdivide these further. So the way we'll do that is we've got them all selected. Let's go to mesh, commands, and then subdivide. Now subdivide, like a lot of the commands, you can either just click it here and it'll subdivide by the default amounts, or if you just see, if we move to our cogwheel here, we can increase how many subdivisions we require. Now we don't need anything more than one, but it's always worth clicking on that subdivision amount, because earlier in a scene, if you'd subdivided something and maybe subdivide it by 10, it'll kind of retain that setting of 10, and so you might end up creating geometry with millions and millions of extra polygons, which might not be what you wanted. So it's not a bad idea to click on the cogwheel just to see exactly how many subdivisions you'll be subdividing by. So if we click OK, now we have all this more detail. Look how many more polygons we have. So now if we play through the scene, it's going to play an awful lot more slowly, because now the emitter is having to emit so many more particles and it's having to make so many more calculations. But what you'll see is that we will get loads more detailed wrinkles. Look at these. It looks fantastic already. And basically with cloth, the more subdivisions you have, the more fantastic detail you're going to get in your renders. But obviously you're going to have a hit on simulation time. But this is looking way more detailed already. So let's just jump back to our cycles view and see what difference that makes in the render. So now we've got so much more detail here. Let's go into one of our cameras. And this is looking much, much nicer because we're just getting more to play with. Okay. So let's have a think. I think arguably we haven't quite got enough contrast. So This may be because our sky material is just a little bit too powerful now. If we reduce the sky material strength of the sky object and then increase the light object, we're going to introduce a little bit more contrast into the scene, which may accentuate these wrinkles a little more. So let's just see if we can do that. We'll go to the background object, and we're on a strength of 5. Let's just bring that down to 3. So there's, yeah, I mean, there's more contrast now here. So once we've done that, then let's go to our emission nodes. Maybe increase our hot emission. All right. Okay. So then we're getting these nice creasing cloth. And we have a little transparency, not too much. I mean, we could perhaps even, let's go in. Can we can up the transparency by just making this a little whiter, and it's just going to make it slightly more transparent, so we can start seeing the cloth through it. But these are obviously tweaks that we can make forever. But let's play this through a little bit more. So we're also going to get some nicer wrinkles once we reactivate our constraints object as well. But I mean, this is really starting to look nice, I think. I love this cloth material. Once we, as I say, get the constraints in and we start doing some depth of field effects, this is going to look great. Good. Okay, so let's get... let's look at some depth of field now. So this is our first camera angle where the cloth is going to be whooshing away from the camera. So let's go into our Cycles 4D camera tag, and we'll pick, before we set the depth of field, we'll pick a focus area. So hit on the camera, go to the object settings, and the focus distance, we've got a little picker here. So this allows us to pick. You can't obviously do it in the real-time preview window. We do that in the object in the viewport. So where we want to be in focus is maybe somewhere about here, and then go to the Cycles 4D camera tag, and let's just bring up this size a bit. No, not too much, just enough to push it back into the background a wee bit. Okay, so then as it moves away from the camera, it's going to go out of focus. Let's have a look. Okay. Right, so now we've got that set up, I think it's time to activate our constraints. Now, you'll see that this is going to have a big impact on the playback performance. Let's just go back to our normal layout so we can see our... So here we go, we've got our animation developing, and we'll probably start the scene from just after this piece wrinkles over on itself. So probably about here. And we'll get some nice floating cloth with bits of transparency. And then as our strange attractors kicks in, it's going to whoosh away nicely. So here comes the whoosh. Okay, and there it whooshes away into the distance. Nice. So let's go to our Cycles 4D layout. All right, there we are. So what else can we do to this? Before we start to render, obviously, we need to render our setup and texture our dust particles, because at the moment they're not rendering because they don't have any material, of course. So we could do that now, actually. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Create, and we'll go to Cycles 4D, and we'll go to Surface, and we'll make an emission shader. And the emission shader we're going to put on our emitter dust. And you see it's immediately instanced these circular shapes onto our dust particles. Okay, so that's fine. So now what we want to do is we want those, remember we coloured our dust particles dependent on their speed. And the slower particles were going to be orange and the faster particles blue. So what we want to be able to do is access that colour information of the particles in cycles. And the way we do that is we're going to right click and we're going to go to input, and we have got a particle info node. Super helpful. So let's pick that. And what we want to do is take the colour from the particles and put it into our emission texture. And now you can see that we have got that colour. So I'm just going to switch off constraints for a minute. So now we've got our particles. So what are the problems so far with this? Well, first of all, they're just way too big, aren't they? So what we need to do is make some adjustments, and we can do that. We can adjust the size actually in cycles. We don't need to readjust in xparticles. So the way in which we do it, let's go to the dust emitter, and I'm going to go to tags. This is slightly off your screen, but I'm going to go to cycles 4D tags, and there we can see them again, and we're going to do a cycles instance tag. Now, this instance tag is telling us various different things. So what it's doing is, for every particle, it is instancing a sphere which has 24 segments. We probably don't need that many here, actually. So we'll just reduce that, and it means it'll render more quickly. And then we have a size multiplier. Now, at the moment, the sizes, they're just too big, I think. These ones are near the camera, but they're just too big. So we could reduce that by 50, and we could also maybe give it some size variation. Maybe even more size variation. Okay, good. I can increase the strength of my material. All right. Now, arguably, I would say that these particles, the colours are a bit vivid, aren't they? They're incredibly vivid oranges here. So what can we do? Well, we can just tone down the colour that's coming from our particle information with the colour node really easily. So let's right click, go to colour, hue saturation value, drag it in, and all we can do is just turn down the master saturation. And now we've got particles which are far less intrusive. I think actually I've gone way too strong on the emission value. They're too strong. Let's go down to 3. All right. And hit play. And now we've got our particles which are coloured correctly. Okay, very nice. So I'm just a little bit concerned here. I don't quite got enough particles in this area where we're actually looking at this piece of cloth. And I want some in focus ones around here. So let's just pause the real-time preview, and I'm going to jump to my regular layout. So let's come out of this camera. So my start camera is this one. And I'd just like a few more particles here. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, let's go back to the beginning of the timeline. And what we're going to do is cheat. So we will get our emitter dust, which is creating those dust particles. I'm going to control or command click and hold and then drag it, which makes a new one, copy. And this copy, we're going to change it from being a box emission in the object tab to a sphere. And then the sphere, we're going to move it towards our camera. So let's make it bigger than our camera. And let's just make sure that we've got this. So what we want is this kind of encapsulating our camera, our basic camera areas or something like that. And it can come down a bit. Right. So this is where we're going to emit our new particles from. So let's just hit play. And now we've got way more in the view. These look a little bit too big to me, actually, but let's just leave them for now. So now we've got some more particles. Excellent. So fingers crossed this is going to look okay. Now, one thing that we perhaps should have done a while back is kind of cache out or bake out our cloth objects. So then once it's baked, we're able to kind of scrub through and we don't have to chug through frame by frame. And in hindsight, we should have done this really whilst we were setting our cameras up, because it would have been easier. We could have scrubbed through and found those really nice animation points for our camera angles. So not to worry, let's just do that now. So with cloth animations, we've found that it's better with cloth to actually bake these, export them as an Alembic file. It works really well. So we're going to do both methods. We're going to cache our emitter dust particles, and we're going to export out our cloth object as an Alembic. So let's do the cloth first. So before I do anything, I need to make sure, what do I need to do? We need to make sure that our constraints is active, because we don't want intersections. Okay, and then what we need to do is select our thing that we want to bake out. So we want this cloth element, which is our subdivision surface with our cloth deformer and our connect object and all of our planes. So this is what we want to bake out. So have it selected, and then we're going to go to File, Export, Alembic. And it asks you where. So that's fine. I'm going to save it there. And then we've got some settings. So what do you want to save? So the end frame is 160. Let's say 200 just to be sure. So we're going to save the first. Oh, hang on. Let me cancel that. So I pressed enter, which immediately starts the exporting process, which is not what you want to do, because I want to show you the other settings. So I've cancelled it, and let's try again. So File, Export, Alembic. We'll just overwrite that mistake one that I've just made. Yep, overwrite it. Okay, so we've set the start and end frame. So we have selection only ticked. Now this is really important. So this means that it's only going to export what we've got selected in our scene. If we didn't have this ticked and we had cameras and hair and particles, it would export all of those elements within the scene. And we don't actually need that. We just need the cloth. So that's why we have got selection only. So that's good. I'll leave everything else as default, and I'll click OK. And this is going to kind of chug through a little bit like when you cache an object in xParticles. And that's because it's saving frame by frame all of that cloth information. So as this is chugging through, it's kind of saving that to this file, which means when we import that file back into our scene, we're going to be able to disable all of the cloth stuff, all of the cloth solver and the constraints and all the things that are causing this to have slow playback in the viewport, and we'll bring in this baked object, which is going to run nice and smoothly in the viewport. And then all we're going to have to do is stick the same cloth texture on that we've built, and we will be able to scrub through, and everything's going to be working okay. So I'll pause this here, and when it's finished exporting, we'll come back. I'll tell you how long it took, and then we'll get on with the rest of the scene. So that file's baked out to Alembic. It probably took about 10 minutes for that 200 frames to get all that data in there. So let's continue. So what we can do is minimize our cloth elements. So now what we need to do is bring that geometry into our scene that we've just exported. So the way in which we do that is we go to File, Merge. Let's find the .abc file that we've just created and hit Open. And it asks us for some details. Now, it's essential that you get the frame rate correct. So I'm working at 30 frames a second, so that's fine. And everything else is okay. So I'm going to hit OK. And here now is my cloth elements file. So let's just make my original one invisible, all these bits, so we can't see them. And now if we hit play, we're getting pretty much close to what we want. So I'm just going to, let's do it. So now we've got it in our scene. What I'm going to do is I'm going to File and Save Incremental. And now I'm just going to get rid of all this stuff that I no longer need. So I don't need the constraints emitter or the cloth modifier. Don't need it. I don't need those original cloth elements. They can go. The cloth generators can go. And that's it, everything else that we need. So I'm just going to switch off my dust emitters for now. So now I'm able to scrub through this scene. And that's because this is the Alembic file. This is our new cloth elements Alembic file that we exported. And that's working excellently. And now we can scrub. So now if we go to some of our pre-recorded camera angles, let's go to camera 1. And now we can get a really good idea of when this gets whipped away and whether we've got everything as we want it. So that's good. And then whip. Okay, good. So we've got a little bit of, you can see a little bit of kind of problem deformation here. But that's really easily solved. Again, I'm going to hold Alt, click on the subdivision surface. And now that's smoothed out. So that's looking good. Right, so that's excellent now. We've got a much more manageable and quick scene. The subdivision surface has slowed it down somewhat. So let's just in those settings put that down to 0 in the editor and 1 in the renderer. So now it doesn't make any difference in the viewport, but when we render, it's going to be complete. These areas are going to be smoothed out. Lovely. So we will put our velvet material onto our cloth elements. Right. So let's have a go at, let's go back to our Cycles 4D view, hit render. There we go. So this is working pretty well. And we're getting much better feedback. Fantastic. Right, so let's have a look. What else do we need to do? We were looking at those dust particles, weren't we? I think also an area I need to address is earlier on, we made the decision to reduce the intensity of our sky object, and that was to bring in a little bit more contrast, but I think we've gone too heavy on that. I think this cloth is looking too dull. I think we needed to look quite vibrantly bright. We'll do that by increasing that sky. So we live and learn. Let's go to our background texture, which is where the sky texture is plugged into. And this strength, let's put it back up to, say, 6. Yep, so that's in the right direction. That's looking better already, but it needs to be way more. Let's try 11. Okay, that's more like it. That's what we're looking for. That's looking great. So now we've got this, and then as it chugs through, it snaps away. Okay, we're not actually seeing the full frame there, are we? Let's reduce that to 60. Okay, that's better. And then it snaps away from the camera, and that's looking excellent. Really, really nice. I'm very pleased with that. Good. I think we could perhaps just increase the depth of field there, make it slightly shallower. Yeah, that's better. Lovely. Okay, so that's the first one. So where were we? We were looking at changing our dust elements. So let's get these cached out. Well, we'll make some adjustments first, and then we'll cache the dust elements. So let's activate those again. And I'll just hit pause. Let's go to frame 1. Because remember, our dust elements aren't cached, so we need to play these through from the beginning to get an accurate representation of what they're doing. Hit pause. Let's restart our playback. All right, so we've got loads more particles here in the view, which is what I wanted, but obviously they're way too big, aren't they? So what can we do to rectify that? Well, let's just see if we can get enough control in our instance tags. So let's get we'll start with the new particles that we made, which are emitter dust 1. Let's go to the cycle study instance tag, and the size multiplier, let's reduce this way down to say 20, and with less variation. So still too big. Let's go 10. All right. So I think that's looking better. So let's mimic these in our other tags. So we'll go with, what did we do? 10 and 10. 10 and 10. Okay, so that's looking a little bit more subtle, I think. So let's just find, we'll go to our other camera angle, this one. Now this one is kind of comes into force after frame 90, I think. Yeah, look, it's these bits coming around. And we've got these particles. We haven't sorted out the shallow depth of field in this one. So I think we actually need to do a little bit of work on this camera angle, because now that I'm looking at it, we haven't really got a particularly nice angle. This is the movement that we want, but this camera's not quite right yet. So let's pause that. Let's go back to my regular layout, and let's just adjust this camera angle. So what I'll do is I'm just going to take off that protection tag, and let's switch off the dust elements. Right, so this, we want this whooshing around, but we're kind of not quite in the right place for it. So we need it really to start this part of the frame, whoosh around like this. So what can we do to get a better angle? Let's just see. Is this going to work better? We need to be much closer. Oh, that's quite nice. All right, and a bit higher up. This bit, whoosh. Yeah, I like that. I think we could arguably get even closer. Yeah, that is better. So let's just put, I'm just going to copy that protection tag onto there. Right, so let's have a look at that. So back to our cycles view. Yes, now isn't that looking beautiful? Fantastic. Really nice. So we're getting it coming through and whooshing past. Good. So again, we haven't, let's go into the cycles tag, and we haven't got any depth of field sorted yet. So we'll click the camera, we'll go to the focus distance picker, and let's, I mean, we want the cloth to be in focus as it's near the camera really. So maybe this bit, and then go back to the tag, increase this. Okay, and as it's all right. So let's increase that some more. Okay, move forward. So I think our focus distance isn't quite close enough, so let's just adjust that. We want it to be nice and in focus as it's coming past the camera, really. So let's reduce that slightly. All right. Okay, good. So let's go back. Now I want to cache my dust particles, so then we can really scrub through and see everything in great detail. So what do we do? Let's go back to our standard layout, and we need to bring in, we'll activate these two emitters again, dust and dust 1, and we'll go to xparticles, other objects, cache. Here's our cache object. Now, depending on how many xparticles elements you have in your scene, it may be a bit of a nightmare trying to work out which things you do want to cache and which things you don't want to cache. So if that's the case, if you've got loads of elements, so there's only a couple of things you want to cache, there's a really quick way of ensuring you only cache the necessary items. If you go to the cache object, into the inclusion tab, and in the mode, if we change this to include, then we can just drag in the two things we want to cache. And I know that everything else in the scene isn't going to be looked at by this cache. So it's a really good, quick way of getting that sorted. Excellent. So let's just go back to the beginning. Go to the cache object. I'm just going to cache this internally to internal memory and hit build. Now this should fire through quite quickly, but remember I only need to get to frame 200 because that's all I cached in the Alembic, and I'm not going further anyway. So as soon as it gets to 200, we will press cancel, and that will consign those first 200 frames to memory. So cancel. Let's put this back down to 200. Good. So now we have particles which are cached. Great. Whoosh. Oh, got a nice angle there for free as well. Didn't even know we had that one. So I might probably render out all of that because it's looking pretty cool. All of that from, I would say, from here, from frame 80 to frame 200, we've got loads of nice movement. So we'll render all of that in camera 1. That's great. So let's go back to our cycles layout and have a look at what we've got. So now we've got the dust particles in as well, and this is starting to look really cool. Excellent. So we're getting close now to getting ready just to render this out. So what we need to do now is establish how many samples we're going to need approximately to get a nice clean render for final output. So let's, in our subdivision surface, let's activate it so it's the same as the render. And I think we'll probably only need to do that. We'll probably only need one subdivision, really. 2 might be a little bit like overkill. Yeah, so I'll just stop that. And let's reduce this down to 1 and 1. Okay. There we go. Way quicker. And that's fine because it's sorted out all of those issues that we were suffering with those jagged edges. Right. So looking good. So let's just see if we can make this a bit bigger. Let's get an idea of a full frame. So we can use the real-time preview to judge what kind of samples we're going to need in our final render to get a result that we're happy with. So this is rendering away at the moment, and it's set to 25 samples. And we can see that we've got a I mean, the render time of, I'm going to say this is going to be around a minute long, I would say, which isn't the end of the world. But what we want to look at is for areas where we've got some noise and whether or not the amount of samples we have got is getting rid of that noise. So areas to look at are shadowy areas. So you can see some noise in this shadow area of the cloth. And also if you've got highly defocused areas like these particles here, you can notice that there are kind of dust noise elements in there. So that's what we're looking to clean up with this. And it's getting better as this is chugging through. It's doing more and more samples. It's taking longer and longer, obviously. And what have we got now? We're down to almost finished, and it's over a minute. So 1 minute and 10 seconds. So we've got a little bit of noise here and a little bit of noise in our kind of bokeh dust particles. But this may be sorted out with, instead of increasing the samples, we could try some denoising. So that's one camera view. So let's do that. Let's go to, we'll go to our render settings, and we will select Cycles 4D and hit the Cycles 4D menu. And then what we're going to do is change a few things. So my device, I'm going to be rendering with GPU. So I'm going to select CUDA, leave everything else default. In the integrator, I'm going to put my 25 samples, which is what we tried in here, which looked okay with a little noise remaining, but not too much. So I'm going to click my 25 samples. And then what I'm going to do is we have a diffusion depth of 2 set here in our ray depth. We have a transparency depth of 8, and we have transparency on our scene, so this is important. And we have a transmission depth as well. Transmission depth is going to be relevant to us for this scene, but transparency is. So let's up our max ray bounces to at least 2, so we're getting this diffuse depth of 2. Okay, so that's that. And the last thing, we're going to try to sub-denoising, which it'll render through all of the samples like we did in our real-time preview, but then once it's rendered it, it's going to try and remove this noise with some very clever kind of blurring techniques. So I'm going to keep it all default, apart from the strength, which I'm going to put way down. I don't want much of this to happen at all. Good. So we're going to output this frame to the picture viewer. So I'm going to uncheck save, because I don't need to save this to disk. And I'm going to go to my output tab. And let's make this full 1080p. Current frame. Okay, that's looking good. So now if I hit render, it's going to render this to the picture viewer. So let's just increase the size of that a bit so we can see what's happening. Okay. So what this is doing, it's rendering it with buckets that you dictate how big these GPU buckets are in the render settings. It's rendering all of the samples first, and then after it's rendered those samples, it's then applying the denoising effect. So this is the full view, and this cloth texture is looking really nice. And you can go more subtle with this. Obviously, you don't need to have it as kind of jagged as this, but I think it's looking pretty decent. I like the look of it. So what we're looking for is, again, in the shadowed areas, is that denoising managing to smooth this out at all? And we'll want to be looking at these once it's finished. I'm not sure if it's actually denoised them. So here it's telling you it's denoised 5 of the tiles. So arguably we might need a little bit more, because I think the denoising's taken place in this tile here, and we've still got some noise in these blurred out particles. So maybe we could up that noise just a little bit. You can see that this had significant impact on our render times. We're already up to 1 minute and 40 seconds. And let's just come out. We're nowhere near finishing the entire thing. But it's looking fantastic. So I'm saying we're going to have a render time of around 2 minutes 30 for a 1080p frame of this, which I don't know. It might leave you weeping with your head in your hands, but it's not too bad when we've got so much going on. Okay, that's looking nice. So yeah, 2 minutes 30 to finish that. Let's just get the real size. So look, we've got noise here, and you can see this weird blobby speckliness is the denoising actually. So perhaps, but this isn't the end of the world. Look, we've got some really nice blurred out detail here, and I think these settings are looking okay. And in all honesty, I don't mind a little bit of noise in these blurred out kind of bokeh effects, because if you looked at stuff that was filmed on real film with a shallow depth of field, you'll see animated noise inside of those areas anyway. So I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world. So what we'll do, let's go back to our render settings. Back to cycles. So one thing I forgot to do actually, which when rendering a still doesn't matter, but if you're rendering a sequence using denoising, you need to make sure that you pick a seed number here of anything greater than 0. If this seed is 0, it means the noise will animate frame to frame, which is what you want really if you're not using denoising, because it'll look realistic. Realistic noise on film animates. It's flickery. But if you're using denoising, you want that noise pattern to be consistent from frame to frame. So by giving it a seed number, it remains the same on a per frame basis, which means the denoising, you're not going to get weird kind of animated blurring artifacts. So let's just stick that onto 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick up my samples to 28. So we've got some more samples. And the final thing I want to do here is, if you notice in my picture viewer, these particles are moving. Now, arguably, we need a bit of motion blur on these. But do you know what? I'm going to try rendering without motion blur. We don't want too much motion blur on these anyway, because we want to see them being pulled along by the cloth when we get to those points. So I'm going to risk it for a biscuit and not render motion blur with these. You may want to do a test, render a few frames and render them with motion blur and without, and see which one you prefer. But I'm just going to gamble and not render it with motion blur. Right, so what we need to do is set up our frame ranges for our different cameras. So let's do that. So let's go to our... I've got a render layout here actually, which gives me a little bit more control. So what have we got? So let's go to camera 1, which is our first camera. And this we want to render from about, well, let's just give us a bit of wiggle room so we've got some handles. So let's render from frame 19 to, it's going to snap away. And then we want enough time to add transition. Yeah, so as it's curving away, maybe. So 19 to 79, let's say to 80. So in this one, I'm going to go to the frame range, and we want manual, and we want from 19 to 80. And we want a full 1080p. Okay, that looks good. So also what I want to do is, before we save this, I'm just going down to my cameras here, and I'm just going to rename them so we've got a naming convention so we're not going to get confused. So what we want to do is the first camera, let's rename it just camera 01, and the second camera, call it camera 02. And we want to look through our camera 1. Okay, good. So then we're going to go to the Save tab, and this is where we're going to save our file sequence to. So we make sure that Save is checked here, and we need a save path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder Render Scenes. Okay, good. And we want to save inside render scenes. And I'm going to make a folder for each camera. So new folder, and this one will call it render cam 1. And go inside there. And we'll call it the same. We'll just call it cloth render cam 1. Okay, and save. Excellent. So now we've done that. We've saved the file path. We've got the correct camera selected here. So let's save this scene now as its own individual thing. So let's go to File, Save As, and we'll put it inside our render scenes, and we'll call this one cloth render cam 1. So that scene's saved now, and that's ready to go for render time. So let's create our new scene, which we're going to do to render camera 2. So we'll get camera 2 active. In the render settings, it's a different output, isn't it? It's 90 frames through to 200 at 1080p. And then in the save dialog, we need to give it a different path. So let's make a new folder and call this render cam 2, and go inside there, and the file path wants to be cloth render cam 2. Excellent. And then we can file, save as to save the scene. And the scene, we're going to call it the same, but cam 2. Right. So now we have 2 separate scene files, one for camera 1 and one for camera 2, and we have the file path set correctly for each render that we're going to do. So because we've got more than one Cinema 4D files to render now, we can use the render queue to good effect. So let's go to render and render queue. Just going to delete what's in there. There were a couple of practice ones. So now what we want to do is go to file, and we want to open, and let's open cloth render cam 1, open it, and then cam 2 as well. So now we've opened those 2 different files in this render queue. So now all we need to do is hit render here, and it will render the first scene. And when that's finished, it'll automatically start rendering the second scene. So if you've got lots of scenes that you need to get rendered without having to reload them every time, this is a very good way of doing it using the render queue. So I'll start this rendering, and then I'll get back to you once they're both finished. I'll tell you how long it took, and we'll put them together to see how our final render looks. So our first scene is finished rendering, and I decided to stop the process there because I had this little niggling feeling that it wasn't a wise move to render these particle elements in here, the dust elements, without motion blur. And I thought, let's not render out the whole thing and then make that discovery once it's all finished and it's been hours and hours. So I had a quick look, and unfortunately, my concerns were right. This is 3D. Never try and take shortcuts because it never works. We've got this scene and it looks really nice. The cloth looks fantastic. I'm really pleased with it, and I'm pleased with the texture. We've got this nice flowing movement. The partial transparency, I think, works very nicely, and then it gets blown away by the strange attractors, and that works really well. So I'm very pleased with that. It looks good, but these particles are moving so quickly that they do need a little motion blur because they just don't quite make sense, and they look a little bit too flickery. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go back, we'll set up some motion blur. And the only other thing I'm going to do is, I'm also glad that I've discovered this, is that I think we could probably do with rendering just a few more frames. It's only supposed to be a very quick shot, but we want it to be whipped away. But I really like the way it's curving round and being whipped around here. And I'd just like a few more frames to play with in the edit. So that would be good. So let's put some motion blur on these particles, and we'll re-render with a few more frames, and then I think we're going to be in business. So let's minimize that. So here we are in Cinema 4D, and this is my cloth render cam 1 project. So what we want to do is we want to put some motion blur onto these particles. So what do we do to do that? Well, let's just disable the cloth for now. So we're not going to be looking at the cloth. So now we have a blank scene, and if we just hit play, we'll get these particles. Right, so there they are in the real-time preview. So what we want to do is activate motion blur. So to do that, we'll go to our render settings, to the Cycles 4D render settings, and let's just come down here, and we've got the motion blur tab, and then not many options. So let's enable motion blur. But this is a key point, and there it is immediately. We've got it on our scene. It's a little bit too much, isn't it? It's too heavy. These trails look ridiculous, frankly, so we need to put a faster shutter speed on to reduce the effect of that. But here's a setting that's important. We want to uncheck affect all objects, and the reason we want to do that is that we only want the motion blur to be applied to the particles, not to the cloth. I want the cloth to remain crisp looking. So we're going to disable that, which means that motion blur will only be applied to objects which have the appropriate tag on them. So let's just highlight both of our emitter dusts, and we'll go to tags, Cycles 4D tags, and object tags. Let's click that, and they both get an object tag. So now what we can do in that object tag, we've got all of these different tabs. There is a motion blur tab, and if I activate it, now we've got our motion blur back, but this will not affect our cloth because that hasn't got the appropriate tag. Excellent. So now, how do we reduce the amount of motion blur? Well, it's real world physics, Cycles 4D. So we need to do what you do in the real world, and to reduce motion blur, you need a faster shutter speed on your camera. So let's go to camera 1, and we'll hit it, and you'll see that we have a shutter time of 0.033. So I think we could maybe go 0.008. Let's see what that does. Yes, that's reduced it significantly. Look, we've just got a little bit of motion blur now on these faster ones. I think that's enough. It needs to be a subtle effect, this. Otherwise, it's going to look a bit silly. We could maybe go I don't know. I mean, we could maybe go have a wee bit more. Okay, so that's going to do us for our motion blur. Excellent. So that's fine. Let's go to our output tab in our render settings. And we said we wanted a few more frames. So let's just do 10 more frames. We'll make it 19 to 90. I'll just pause that. Let's reactivate our cloth. Okay, so we've done our motion blur, we've reactivated cloth, we've set to render a few more frames, so that's us. So let's go to File and Save. All right, so that's okay. Now have I still got camera 2? So let's go to cloth render camera 2, and we need to do the same thing for this. So let's just disable the cloth for now. Let's resim there. So here's our particles. And we need to select both emitters, and just move over this so you can see the tags. So tags, Cycles 4D tags, object tag, and in the motion blur, let's activate. We need to go to the render settings, Cycles 4D, and find the motion blur button. Great. And we will uncheck affect all objects, so it's only going to affect objects that's got the tag on with it selected. And now we want to go to our camera, and let's just reduce the amount. So 009 was what we did in the other one. Okay, so there we've got some motion blur. I'm going to even reduce it fractionally more. All right, so that's much better. So the frames were okay in this one, so let's just reactivate our cloth. I'm going to switch that real-time preview off because we don't need to see it whirring around. So that is us. We're on the right camera yet. So let's save this file. Okay. Excellent. Now there's one more thing I need to do before we hit render. I'm going to go back to my cloth render cam 1 project file. And I just need to give it in the save box. I need to give it a slightly different file path, because if I give it the same, it'll just overwrite this first render that we did. So let's inside here, let's just put render 02. Okay. And I'm going to copy this name, copy, go into the new folder, and I'm just going to put version 2. That's what it's going to be called. So now we're going to get all new files. Great. Okay, so now I can go save. Excellent. So let's bring open our render queue once more then. So render queue. Here you can see my one that completed that I've got rid of because it wasn't right. Get rid of that. Okay, so let's bring in our new files. So open, and we want cam 1. Open it. And we want cam 2. Open it. And now we're ready for business. So let's start it rendering. And that's it. So I'll keep this going, and then once it's finished, I'll come back to tell you how long it took. We'll put these two parts of this sequence together, and we'll have a look at it. So here's our final render. This took about 5 hours to render both of those Cinema 4D projects, which is it's pretty heavy, I suppose, for the amount of frames that were rendered. But there was a lot of stuff going on in this scene, and I'm pretty pleased with the results. So I've just cut together a very brief sequence from those two those two scenes that we had, and it kind of works okay. I mean, it's obviously just a quick and dirty job, but we get the effect. So I think this section really works well here. This first floaty section, I think this material is looking really nice here. I'm pleased with this. So what we've got is this obvious weave in the material, which looks nice, and then we've got this level of transparency so we can see the cloth behind it and the folds. I think this is working really nicely. And then we've got this section where it suddenly gets ripped away from us and gets whooshed around the corner, and there's a really nice bit of animation as this bit turns the corner. So then we cut to our other scene, and again this looks really detailed and great coming up towards the camera. Some really nice folds and details in this cloth. This shot was a bit of a cheat. I've actually flipped it over, so this is kind of a mirrored angle just to give us a little bit more bang for our buck. And then there's the final one. So there's a beautiful kind of detailed in this wrinkled cloth here. So all in all, that's looking pretty decent. So we'll end this one there. That is rendering our cloth simulation using the Strange Attractors modifier with Cycles 4D. There are loads more free official training videos at the INSYDIUM YouTube channel. So please go along, hit subscribe, and you can view those videos and get the new content as soon as it's released. So until next time, I'll see you later.